Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I have a special guest today. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a board certified behavioral analyst. She has a Instagram presence and online presence called Thriving Toddler, and she even has a course where she teaches parents kind of the ins and outs of discipline. Michelle Tangeman is her name, and she lives in LA and practices there, but practices online too, and does a lot of things to support families in this new world we live in where there's a lot more online stuff than there used to be. And I'm really excited to get to talk to you today, Michelle. Maybe could you just give my audience just a little bit of a background about you, and then we'll jump into some toddler discipline questions.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Phil, for having me here. I'm excited to talk about toddlerhood with you. So, a little bit about me. I'm a mom of two. I have a 3.5-year-old and a 11-month-old.
Awesome.
He was born right before our country shut down. So, I have a pandemic baby, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I'm a mom of two, and I have been practicing. I've been a practicing clinician for 15 years now. And so most of my practice has been working at an agency that provides behavioral and psychological services for children and families. And I've worked all over Ventura County and LA County here in SoCal. And right now I have a private practice where I see parents. I actually have specialized training in perinatal, postpartum depression and anxiety. So I see parents and I also see moms primarily in my
Wow.
private. And
That's
then,
amazing. That's such a great resource. And I'll interrupt you there and just say that like that's something that we need more of. And I have many podcast episodes where we talk about perinatal and postpartum depression and anxiety. So I'm so glad, and it sounds like that must be such a great practice for you to be paired up with moms right after delivery as they're going through everything. And then if they need support with parenting as their child grows, then they can turn right back to you.
absolutely, it's like a whole package.
Yeah.
I love it. I love working with parents because my primary focus is really doing a lot of parent training and
Mm-hmm.
empowering parents. Because parents are the ones that are they're living with their child, they're with their child all the time. So I'm really about empowerment. So
That is
and
fantastic.
with Thriving Toddler, I really wanted to expand my reach. I wanted to have a little bit more of an online presence and be able to share the psychoeducational piece around behavior management with parents. And so that's why I started Thriving Toddler. And I really, really enjoy connecting with parents through social media. And I think parents are often surprised. So like, I didn't expect you to respond to my direct message. And I don't give specific advice, but I always like to connect. And if I have a post that maybe answers their question, I happily send it their way. So for those of you that are listening, that are following me, don't be afraid to send me a direct message. Eventually, I will respond to it.
That's my I try and set the expectation of it might take a few days for me to get to your question. If it's an emergency question, direct message isn't the right approach, but it does give me lots of good discussion points for things like this. So I'm glad that you have found that too, and I think that in the midst of a pandemic, having resources like Thriving Toddler is so helpful for parents, especially when everybody guilty is spending more time on their phones, that they're getting that good information while they're surfing through and scrolling through social media. Now, you have a really interesting approach and good approach, I think, to discipline. And maybe if you could just like set up for us what is discipline, because I get asked a lot by parents like, what should our discipline strategy be? And oftentimes it's very specifically contextual to like, how do I deal with this one
Right.
naughty, annoying behavior? And I try and redirect them to like looking at the big picture rather than the head banging on the wall or the throwing the remote or whatever it is, and look at the big picture. But can you talk to us about what discipline is in the way that you practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to be clear and right to the point. And what I want parents to take away from this in terms of discipline is really it's teaching. I want to move away. I want to create a movement where we're moving away of discipline, meaning consequence based, meaning
Right.
punitive, right? So I want to move away from that and say discipline is really about teaching, because our toddlers and our preschool age kids, and even beyond, even in childhood, kids are learning. They're in this constant state of learning and navigating their social world. So you're really going to see a lot of this right around the age, and again, it varies depending on your child, but around the age of 1, you kind of start to see them asserting their independence as they become more mobile, right? They're moving away
Sure.
from their primary caregiver. They're exploring their world. They're not aware of what a misbehavior is and what appropriate behavior is, right? So we
Right.
are
Right.
their guideposts. That's what I want parents to know about discipline. So you're right. The number one question always is, how do I get my child to stop, you fill in the blank? And the biggest one
Right.
is the tantrums and the meltdowns,
Hmm.
right? And you're right.
Right.
Kind of take a step back. I think what's really important is that parents are always looking for like a script. That's another popular question. And although I
Hmm.
love the examples that are out there, I think what's most important is taking a step back and talking with your partner, your parenting partner, and saying, what are our family values around parenting? What's important to us? Number one, right? Because you can take those scripts and you can pick and choose what you like, but ultimately, what's most important to your family, right?
Right.
We hope that I'm assuming that all of us want a happy, healthy relationship with our children, right? So that's the foundation. That means connection. So if that is a value of ours, how are we making decisions in our everyday that are meeting those values of ours,
Right. I
right?
love that.
So I think that the values work is really, really important, because I don't know that a lot of us are really taking the time and sitting down with our partners saying, what kind of parents do we want to be, right? Because each of us bring our own individual experiences with our parents into our world and the way that we parent our children, right? Because our parents were our models.
Right.
And so I think it's important to kind of sit down and reflect, what did I like about my parents parenting me, and what did I not like? What can I leave behind? And how do I want my parents to be, or how do I want my children to be able to navigate their social world? What skills do I hope that they'll be able to have? So that's the foundation. I like to start there.
So
And
what I'm
then
hearing
move.
you say is instead of like you get through that bleary first year where you're exhausted and just trying to keep them fed and everything like that and get some sleep, and then they start in that, like after 12 months oftentimes, or right around there, they'll start kind of doing things, and you then have to figure out how to respond to what they're doing, whether it be a tantrum, whether it be hitting or biting or things like that. And parents in my practice too often come in and they're like, well, how do I stop this specific behavior, and how do I stop this specific thing? And when I was earlier in my parenthood too, it was like, okay, this week's consequence of the week is such and such, because the consequences wear off over time. So you have to keep, shuffling through and trying to figure out new consequences, or ratchet it up until we're, if you don't eat your peas, we're not going to Disney World or something like that. I mean, you get to that point where you're just kind of like, how do I figure out these consequences that actually work and make a difference? And what I'm hearing you say, and what I try and teach parents as well, is it's instead you focus on the teaching. And I love how you brought in values too, because if you stop and think, what are our values? Let's base our parenting style and the way that we teach on our values. So once you've established, okay, these are the values that we hold dearly, and like you said, family of origin certainly plays a role in that too. Do we want to parent like our parents, or do we want to parent differently than our parents? Where do you go from there then, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great, yeah. And that sets me up beautifully for my next point is, okay, so you have a solid understanding, because when it comes to parenting, it's really important that both parents are on the same page. Because if you're constantly changing up the consequences, and I want to emphasize that consequences for me defined is just a response. It's not
Sure.
positive or negative. It's just a response after a particular behavior. So if mom is responding one way and dad is responding a different way, that's going to create confusion for the child, right? And so oftentimes these behaviors continue to happen. So moving on from values, the next step is really Number one is if you're feeling triggered by your child, just to pause. It's always okay
Okay.
to pause and not respond. Okay. Just give yourself a minute to collect yourself and say, okay, remember, I am modeling, I'm a model for my child. Everything that I
Right.
do, they're watching. Okay, so that's number one. And then number two, here's the meat of my teaching, and that is, what is my child trying to communicate through this behavior?
Okay.
Right? The 12 months, your child probably doesn't have a lot of words, right? They're not communicating. They're communicating different ways by maybe eye contact, pointing, gesturing, signing, if you're teaching signing, but they're probably not using expressive language. So,
Mm-hmm.
with that said, look at what's happening around you, look at what's happening in the environment, and ask yourself, what is my child potentially communicating? Okay.
Right.
So, pause, think about that, and then think about, what can I teach again, discipline meaning teaching. What can I teach my child to do instead? What would be more appropriate in the situation? So a common one that comes up is, let's look at like a 10-month-old. A 10-month-old, you're in the high chair and you're eating, and the child like starts to throw their food. Very common, very typical, right? Like they're exploring the food, and you want that, you want to encourage that.
Sure.
But as they get older, a little bit older, that starts to become inappropriate, right? Like we no longer
At
want them to
least
start playing
annoying.
with the food and throwing it, right?
Right. Right.
Then what do? We make this shift. We make this shift and like, okay, so is my child trying to teach? Is my child trying to communicate to me that I'm all done eating? Or
Mm-hmm.
do I want more attention? Or do I want more food? Or am I just playing with my food because it feels good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just covered four main reasons why a child might be engaging in that particular behavior. And the reason why I don't share on Instagram, this is how you should respond, is because your response is specifically tailored to one of those four reasons. Because the way that you would respond, let's say, to a child just wanting to play and have fun is going to be different from if your child is saying, like, I'm all done, get me out of here, get me out of
Right.
this chair, right? So that's why it's important to say, okay, based on what my child is has had already, I think my child is full. I'm not giving my child a lot of attention right now because maybe I'm preparing my husband's meal or doing something else. You take those factors under consideration and say, okay, I think my child's trying to tell me I'm done.
Right.
So you may want to prompt like all done, either verbally or paired with a gesture or paired with a sign. That's really up to you, right?
Okay.
What's important to you. So that is the important piece, is what's happening, what is my child communicating, and what can I teach instead?
Okay.
So that way you're less likely to be reactive and respond in a way that you might feel guilty later on, right? Um, and so that's really what I want parents to take away from this.
It sounds like one thing that I feel like a lot of parents worry about is, if I don't teach them immediately, then like a dog, they will have forgotten about it, and you can't take a dog back over and like show them where they peed on the rug or something like that. But we know that children are not dogs, and you can pause, like you said, and collect yourself, and then decide how to proceed from there. You don't have to have an immediate consequence. You don't have to have immediate, whether it be positive or negative. You can just take some time to think, even if they're throwing their food on the ground, like, you're already going to have to clean up the mess. Let's see where they're at before we just, rip the food out of their hand, or, pull them out of the chair or something like that. So that seems to me to make sense, that if you can first pause and look at what's going on and assess the situation, then you'll be much better prepared to then make the right choice as a way to teach.
Absolutely. And that pause allows you to really collect yourself so that you aren't being reactive, right? So you're kind of taking, sometimes parents also think that their child is doing certain behaviors on purpose. And
Right.
in most cases, your child is not doing anything intentionally or on purpose to maybe upset you or get you angry, or they're not listening to you because they intentionally don't want to do what you're saying.
Right.
Um, it's genuinely where they're at in their brain development, right? So that pause, I think, is crucial in the way that we approach our child's behavior.
And I think a lot of times parents put it together that my toddler is trying to bother me, or they like doing this because it really gets me upset. Well, it might be that they need attention. And in the past, when they bit or hit their sibling or, banged their head on the wall, then they got attention. And then so they're just going back to what previously has worked to get attention, not what has previously worked to anger you or frustrate you, although it might satisfy that requirement as well.
You're right on, right? That's social learning theory. It's, oh, hey, that worked before, so I'm going to try that again and see if it works again.
Right.
So you're right on.
So let's take another example, and let's do the example because I kind of brought it up, and I've seen that written on your website too. Is the specific one of toddler hits baby sibling.
Yeah.
How would you approach that? You walk into the room and you see the 24-month-old hitting his sibling on the head, while the sibling is trying to rest or not be bothered.
Absolutely. This is a very popular question on Thriving Toddlers Instagram, my Instagram. And again, so let's look at what's happening in the environment, right? So I want you to kind of get curious and investigate what's going on. Like, where is my attention? Where's my husband's attention? Where's the baby? And what is my toddler trying to communicate? Oftentimes in my experience, it's happening one of two reasons. They want something, and that's usually in the form of social attention. Okay, so for example, let's say a mom is breastfeeding a baby and the toddler is playing, and then all of a sudden comes over and hits the baby. And you're, of course, surprised and shocked. And I don't like, whoa, what just happened?
Right.
And you want to respond. You want to respond because you're like, no, that's not okay. It's never okay to hit. And so usually what happens is that actually rewards the behavior. If the child is looking for parental attention or social attention, then that's actually saying it's working. So it's really
right, because you just got a lot of attention. Like
Exactly.
a big attention deposit into the attention bank was just given when you hit, and I then went off on the rails and told you all the ways that you could hurt your baby brother, and don't you love him, and why are you being so mean, and like just all the different things that you might come out of one's mouth in that moment.
Attention is attention, whether it's positive or negative to them, there's no difference. It's if it got a reaction, then this worked. And so if it works, that's called that behavior was actually positively reinforced by the parent. And so that behavior is more likely to occur again in the future under the same conditions. Okay. So
Okay.
what do you do? So if I can't respond and hitting is not okay, what would be the best response? It's actually stay calm, make sure the baby is safe, gently get up, remove yourself from the situation. And then when you've collected yourself, the baby is safe and okay, come back, make sure, assuming that your toddler is nice and calm, because if your toddler is dysregulated and engaging in a tantrum, there's no learning happening. That is not the appropriate time to be teaching or providing an opportunity to learn. So
Right.
what would more appropriate would be remove yourself, come back, everybody's calm, and then say, how can you get mommy's attention? Right? So that's the teaching opportunity. And so what would be appropriate? You could come over and tap mommy's shoulder. You could say, mommy. Again, that just depends on where they're at developmentally and what age they are.
I love that. I think that is a good approach, and it's you got the pause in there because we know we're not going to learn anything if we're yelling at them and they're upset and in the moment of it, but you're making sure the baby is safe. I mean, I have never seen a sibling inflict any sort of injury that was, warranted coming to the doctor because of what their sibling did to them. It's poking in the eye, it's poking in the anterior fontanelle, it's hitting them in the head. I mean, those are just normal things that toddlers do. They know how strong and how not strong to hit another person, but it does get that attention. So I like that approach of how can we make a better choice next time.
And here's another piece to this, and that is think about what's an appropriate way to interact with a baby, between a toddler and a baby. And I would say keep it to 2 or 3 very specific example. So in my house, I told my toddler it would be okay when we first brought the baby home. Um, gosh, just like living in the time of COVID also changed that. But for us, it's okay if you want to touch your baby, your baby brother, it's okay. But you could tickle his feet like this, right? Or you can pat his back like this. And so we would show her, we would help her do it. Of course,
Right.
she was a little timid. But when we gave her lots of attention for that, like, I love how you're interacting with your brother, you're touching his back. We appreciate that so much. And then she was thriving off of that. She's like, oh,
Sure.
that's great. Like, that feels good. So then guess what? If that was positively reinforced, and so she was more likely to do those exact behaviors in the future. So that's
Right.
the other
Because she got that
component.
attention from that. So it's like, oh, I get attention if I hit him, but I also get attention if I tickle his feet, and I get a lot more positive attention, and it feels better when I get that attention from tickling his feet. So I'm going to keep doing that.
Exactly, because I think that this is a big trigger for any parent out there. When you see a child being aggressive with a baby, like, that's going to trigger any parent. And what I don't want to happen is, oftentimes I hear that parents, they don't know, right? Because we parent the way that we were parented. And so what ends
Right.
up happening is some parents resort immediately to, like, let's say, a timeout.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not always appropriate. And I'm a big advocate in teaching what timeout really is and how it looks, because I think there's a lot of misconception about timeouts. And so I want to encourage parents. Another big takeaway I want parents to take to focus on is, again, focus on the teaching and positively reinforcing it. Enrich your child's environment with positive reinforcement. And that's going to look different for every child, because every child is
Right.
motivated by different levels of attention, different stimuli, different toys. So it really just making sure that you're observing and really spending a lot of time in terms of playing as much as you can, because that's a great way for your child to also learn and master these social skills that we're trying to teach them.
Well, let's dive into timeout a little bit more because I want to hear your thoughts on timeout because I get asked a lot about timeout, and my opinion of timeout has shifted in the past 10 years as a parent and as a pediatrician. And as you know, it's nice because I get to talk to parents, give them some ideas, and then see them back in a few months and say, hey, how did that work? Or are you guys still
Yeah.
struggling with that? And it's kind of like my own little lab of trying things out for parents. And I've gotten away from timeout for the most part because I just don't find that it changes behaviors. At the end of the day, parents want their behaviors to change, and I don't feel like timeout typically makes a difference in the behavior. So, can you walk me through what timeout should be and when or if or how to use timeout?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the procedure. So timeout is a procedure. Okay, it's not a place. And
Okay.
if you are a millennial, it's likely that if your parents used a timeout, they probably used it because they were mad. You did something, they were
Hmm.
mad. They send you to your room and you're crying, right? And you're upset, and now you're isolated in your room. That is what people in general think a timeout is.
Right.
Timeout, as it's is stated in the research, timeout is simply timeout from positive reinforcement. So if
Okay.
you're, quote unquote, in a timeout situation, your child isn't getting positive reinforcement from a parent, from a peer, from anything.
Okay.
And timeout is actually highly, highly effective. However, with that said, there is a time and place, and there are different forms of timeouts. Parents, so the one that I described in my example, in terms of parent, you do something, parent gets mad, you get sent to your room. That is called an exclusionary timeout. And exclusionary timeouts clinically are not used very often. They're
Okay.
not really recommended. In my time in working in the school districts, rarely ever did I ever put in a IEP that a timeout should be used, an exclusionary timeout.
Okay.
They're only to be used in my clinical practice in extreme situations when that child is harming other people or themselves.
Okay. That makes
Okay.
sense.
So, but there are other forms of timeout that are called non-exclusionary timeouts. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term planned ignoring, but oftentimes when parents are like, oh, my child is engaging in all this behavior for attention, I'm just going to ignore them. That's actually a form of timeout. It's a non-exclusionary timeout. Okay. So if used properly, is highly effective and very short
Sure.
term. But with that
Okay.
said, a parent should not consider a timeout until they have exhausted all of their positive, proactive, and teaching strategies. Okay.
Okay.
And then also, a timeout should not be used if a child doesn't understand or cannot follow directions. So if your child is 2 or younger, it's probably not appropriate for you to be using a timeout. Really, I like to recommend timeouts as a last resort if a child is about the age of 3 or 4, and
Okay.
only in situations where you have done your absolute best to provide that positive reinforcement, and enriching what's called the time in environment. Does that
That makes
clarify
complete
what
sense.
timeout is?
Yes, definitely. So, could you describe a circumstance where you would use the non-exclusionary timeout and what that would look like?
Yeah. So an example I like to give often is like, let's think about in your home, 2 siblings. Okay, so maybe they're both above the age of 2, under the age of 5. There's going to be a lot of squabbling, right? Like they want the same
Sure.
toys. It's just it comes with the territory, right?
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
let's just say over a 6-month period, you have tried to point out all the good things, right? Like both siblings, you're saying, I like that you're sharing. You point out every time that they are sharing or that they're playing cooperatively together. You set up situations where you're helping to facilitate, but it's very natural. And let's say you're doing all of those things, okay? And after about 6 months, you're like, I'm not making a lot of progress. I'm doing a lot of teaching, a lot of facilitating. I'm using a lot of positive reinforcement in the form of verbal praise, and it's just not working. It's just
Okay.
not working. So let's try maybe a different positive and proactive strategy. And so you kind of go down the line, right? There are different approaches that you can use. Maybe you decide like, hey, I'm going to use a visual. Maybe I can use like this first then visual, or I can use some kind of visual schedule to help them be able to play more cooperatively together. Or
Okay.
you implement a visual that's like house rules. Okay, so that gives you kind of a good idea of some of the positive proactive strategies you can implement. You do all of that and you're like, we're still struggling. I feel like the intensity of the physical aggression is maybe getting worse. And in your home, you've decided that is absolutely unacceptable. I've done what I can. I think it's time to use a timeout. So
Okay.
we're going to use, let's say, a non-exclusionary timeout, which again means time away from anything that is positively reinforcing. So I want you to envision your 2 kids. Let's say in your house, you guys have a playroom. They're in the playroom, and you see one sibling hit the other. Okay, that would be the time for the parent to intervene and say, um, we don't use our hands in this house to hurt our sibling. Okay, I want you to just to sit down right here on the step, but you could still observe, you still see what's
Sure.
going on. Your sibling can go and play, but right now I'm going to set the timer for 1 minute, and you're not going to be able to go play with those toys for right now, right?
Okay.
That is an example of a non-exclusionary timeout. So you're not removing them from the situation, but they no longer get access to their sibling or to the toys. So that's time away from positive reinforcement. So that is the
Gotcha.
formal definition of how it's defined in the research, in the literature.
Well, that seems to be helpful to for a lot of different reasons. One is you don't have to put them so far away and then like hold their door closed or anything like that. You can just remove them from the situation, but they can still be in eyesight and everything like that of you and of them, of whatever situation they were just in. And then it sounds like what you can do instead is focus on just the active removal of them from that positive reinforcement rather than trying to get them to quiet down or sit still, or we have to start the timer over, or it's 4 minutes because you're 4 years old, and all of these other kind of
Right.
rigid rules that just make it more challenging for parents.
Agreed. Agreed. You do want to have a plan. Like I don't want it. Timeout should never be used again, making sure that the parent is pausing, right? So you want to have a plan. Like I've acknowledged that this has been an ongoing issue for the last 6 months. So now I'm
Right.
going to use timeout, and this is how I'm going to use timeout. You communicate that to your partner so that the both of you are on the same page when you're implementing it. Because if both parents are consistent, that's when you're going to get the most bang for your buck, and you're not going to have to use that timeout procedure for very long. If done properly, it is highly effective and can quickly be faded out. And if it's
Awesome.
not, then we need to readjust the plan.
Sure.
So I don't want to villainize timeout. I want to properly educate parents on what timeout really is.
I think that really clears it up because I think, like you said, especially for millennials and those of age, everybody has a concept of what timeout is, and back in our day, then it was very like standard, like timeout sort of thing that just you exclude them, get them to their room, they're screaming and crying, and they need to stay there until they can calm down on their own, and blah blah blah. And that's what it looked like. So I think that's what a lot of people wrap up with timeout. But what I hear you saying is that it doesn't have to be a way. It's just removal of positive reinforcement from whatever behavior led to it. So awesome.
Correct. That is the emphasis.
Well, I think that you put out such great content on Thriving Toddler, and I'm so excited that you shared those things with us. And I know you have a lot more on your Instagram at Thriving Toddler, and you even have a short course for parents too, and it's called Toddlerhood Declaration of Independence, which I love that name too. And if people want to find that, they can go to thrivingtoddler.com. And then I would love to have you back on again to talk through some more toddler discipline issues, because I can tell you that my inbox gets pretty full of very specific iterations of all of the different toddler issues that come up on a day-to-day basis. And there's so much context that goes into all of those that it keeps me pretty occupied with answering questions. So
I'm sure. And thank you once again for having me. And I look forward to future discussions with you as well.
awesome. Keep up the good work and stay safe out there in LA. I know things are, COVID wise, are not in a good place right now. So I hope that things improve in the next weeks for you all.
Yes, me too.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, will you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos that I put out? And if you'd like to learn more or watch another video, you can click right over here to keep going. Have a good day. Keep up the good work.